As I woke up, I was laying in a pool of perspiration. I literally had a silhouette of my body in the bed, and I shook my wife and I said, something terrible is happening to me, and I think God is trying to tell me something. And so I told her a few things about what had happened, and she said, no, you're just having a nightmare. And, you know, I got to tell you, I knew this was no nightmare. I've had nightmares. How many of you have had nightmares? This was not a nightmare. There's no way. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. I think it was about 10:30 at night when I fell asleep. This had been going for several hours, and I felt a real strong urging to read the Bible, even though I didn't even know if I owned a Bible. I began to search in my garage for a Bible. I eventually found a Bible. It said Holy Bible, St. Joseph Catholic Edition. And I don't even know where I got it. I opened the inside cover, and it said Property of St. Francis School and Church. I don't know how it got to my house. I don't honestly remember stealing the Bible, but I guess I must have, because I had it. I went back into the house. I sat down in a rocking chair and began to read this Bible with diligence. I have a real habit in my life to always flip to the back of things, and I flipped to the back of the Bible, and it said Apocalypse. I have to tell you, I don't know what apocalypse meant at the time. I had no idea what it meant. I began to read, and all I could get out of what I was reading was that Jesus was going to come to his church and take away their candles. As a Catholic, that was very frightening to me, because everything we did was with candles. You know, you had an Advent candle, a Lent candle, a Easter candle, a Christmas candle. You lit candles on the platform. You know, I mean, everything. You had purgatory candles. Everything was candles. And so it made no sense to me. And I fell asleep, and instantly the dream began to start exactly where it left off, me facing this very sinister creature. I think the creature was a demon. Some sort of a demon presence. It was very, very intense, and it gripped my heart. I slammed the door and ran off. I realized that my wife, in fact, wasn't in my home and that she was gone. I knew that by this presence. It's just hard to tell you how afraid I was. But at this time, I had no comprehension of how to deal with this strong, strong evil being. And so I began to run, and I ran and ran and ran. I seemed to believe in my mind, in the dream I ran a couple miles. And I got caught by one of these strange-looking police trucks, by these military police. They knew my name. Even though I didn't tell them my name, they knew my name. And they took me to this government building. It was a large building, and took me into a room, and there was my wife and the older gentleman that I began to call the evangelist. They had been captured, and they knew exactly where to take me. That was very astounding to me, because I wondered, how did they know all this stuff about people? And so they knew things about us, and they took us into this room. I was in there with my wife and this older gentleman. They began to politely interrogate us. They began to ask us to, you know, be cooperative, come into this agreement with this new government, and everything will be fine for you. Well, my wife, who you'll meet if you come to meetings in the future, is one of the boldest Christians I've ever met. She's also probably one of the kindest and most gentle believers I've ever met. But she will get in the devil's face. And she and this older man began to preach to these people that were trying to convince us of this new alignment of this government. And so they took us out of there and put us in another room, and now it was a lot of mind control interrogation. What happened was, my mind, I could feel pulled in almost to this order and say, you know, if we just don't cause any trouble, it'll be okay. That's how my mind began to function. But yet the older gentleman and my wife began to just fight this with all their spiritual strength and challenge it with scriptures. It was amazing to me because the capturing of us was almost as though they had planned it out. You know, I don't know how this being got to my house and how they knew to catch me, but it seemed like it was being planned out. Some strange things that I saw right before this happened to me was that all the nations of the world were as one. There was no longer any sovereign individual nations. Continents were no longer divided into countries, but continents were divided into regions. And one thing I want to tell you about this time, that the awareness of God being on the global scene at this time was nearly impossible to detect. The global order had no presence of God in it whatsoever. Evil, at this point in the dream, had begun to pervade every aspect of society. Darkness was everywhere, and I was telling Stan this, that what I saw was there was a clear line of who was God's people and who wasn't. I mean, you could walk down the street and you would know instantly who was who. It's not like it is right now, whether you're wondering if, sometimes you go into large groups of people and you're wondering, I wonder who's saved here, I wonder who knows the Lord. This was so evident. There was a clear line of delineation. Demarcation was marked spiritually and was clearly seen. When we were being interrogated, the mind control was phenomenal. It wasn't like any human could do in an interrogation. My mind began to really be swept with anxiety and fear. And then because my wife and this older gentleman kept being very bold and kind of in your face with them, they took us out and they took us into this very, very long corridor. In this corridor was thousands of people lined up. The corridor, it seemed to be at least 100 yards long, probably longer. But in my ability, in depth perception in the dream, it was a long, long line of people. And every 5 or 6 minutes, these people would walk forward and take a step. We had been in this line for a long time when people would barge in through the doors on the side of this corridor and begin to grill people and tell them to renounce their faith. They would never use the name Jesus. They would never use the name Jesus Christ. They would never use the name God. But they would say, you should renounce your faith in Him while you can still live. And your faith is empty. And it was a blasphemous kind of challenging that these people were bringing against the people in the line. And every so often somebody would crack. They would just collapse and they would drag them away and they would renounce their faith in Christ. It made me very, very uneasy to be in this line because I wasn't quite sure what they were going to do to us. I wasn't sure if they were going to put us in prison or maybe beat us up to scare us or what. It wasn't made clear yet to us. Eventually, we made it through a battery of 3 double doors. After the last double door, we were put into like a holding cell kind of a room. And there was the old man in the front of the line, my wife, and then myself. And they opened the doors very quickly and took this older gentleman into the room. And I don't know what happened to him at this point of the dream because they shut the doors very quickly. 6 minutes or so later, they opened the doors, this time wide open, and what I saw was the most empty feeling I think I've ever experienced in my whole life. I saw this man that was a very, very big man. I was sharing earlier in the tour that he was tall like a professional basketball player, but he was very big like a professional football player. He was an extremely large man, and he had a big hood, like a satin hood, over his head with eye holes to see out of. My wife was in front of me, and they began to tell her she could renounce her faith and live. And now I realized what was happening because this man was standing there with a huge sword. I probably should have drawn a little transparency tonight to show you what the sword looked like. But to trace it kind of in the sky, so to speak, it started down here with a handle and began to come up like this, and then like this, and then a big arch like this. And it was a very, very frightening looking sword. And then I saw this table that was a little bit longer than the average human being and a little bit wider. And my wife said she wasn't going to renounce her faith in Jesus. She began to preach powerfully. And, I wish even today I was as bold as her right now, because I'm not. And she began to just rebuke the devil, and you name it. I mean, she was doing it. And so they got angry and strapped her down on this table. By the way, it was like this, face first. So she was looking up to the sky with this man standing behind her with this sword. He took the sword and chopped her head right off, right in my presence. I saw it. I don't want to tell you that I want this to happen to my wife. I don't know if this will happen. I've never heard clearly God tell me that I would die as a martyr yet. I know that everything in the dream so far has transpired almost exactly as I saw it. And I knew that in my mind, I could not do this. I was not going to make it. I was paralyzed. And my mind began to torment me and almost became literally blanked out. my stomach began to shout out loud that, Jesus, please help me, I'm afraid. But the message couldn't get out because my mind was paralyzed. And it was as though I had the flu, an extreme case of the flu. My teeth were chattering and I was shaking with chills in this line. I could not process my thoughts whatsoever. It was as though that I had totally lost all faculties of my mind, my ability to cognitively be aware of what was going on at that moment. It was terrible, and although it only lasted for maybe 5 or 6 minutes, it seemed like hours because of the extreme weight of this attack on me. I know a lot now, more than what I did in the dream, about the assaults of Satan and how he can work. But during this dream, I had no idea. I began to really try to cry out in my stomach. All I can tell you is I knew it was my spirit now, but in the dream it was just a war in my stomach and my mind. And finally it's as though something penetrated out of my stomach into my mind, and I was able to spiritually call on Jesus and say, I'm afraid, Jesus, please save me, help me. At the very instant that communication spiritually happened, I felt a hand grip my shoulder. And again, it's very unusual because for a brief period of time I was more interested in the hand gripping me than actually what was happening to me. As soon as this hand gripped me, I got very warm and the chills left me, and it was as though my mind could now see and kind of comprehend clearly what was going on. I'll never forget the hand. It was a very rugged looking hand, and it looked as though it had been through a great deal of work. Almost, you know, like a man who's a blue-collar worker that uses his hands like a mechanic or a builder or a plumber or something. It was a very rugged hand, and it was a very thick hand. It wasn't like mine. You know, I'm kind of a small-boned person, but this was a very solid hand, and it gripped my shoulder, and warmth and peace began to flood through me. After a few moments, I turned back, and there was the Lord Jesus Christ standing behind me. I don't know how he got in that room, because it was just a small holding cell and the doors behind us were shut. And then all of a sudden he looked me in the eyes. He looked at me very, very sternly. It wasn't like a reproof or conviction, but it was more of just him looking and peering into my life. And the most unusual thing occurred to me. At the very instant I looked at him, his eyes were not brown or green or blue or anything like that. They appeared to be red like fire, and they were just looking clearly through my whole life. Somehow at that moment I was able to realize that him looking at me was actually looking through me, and he knew everything of me. He knew my strengths, he knew my weaknesses, he knew every lie deep down inside of me, he knew every deception, he knew every place that I was afraid and I had compartmentalized. My whole being, by him looking into me, was exposed to me. It was very frightening. It was a very intense moment. I wish I could say that seeing Jesus at that moment made me very happy. It didn't. It made me very fearful. I understand now what the fear of the Lord is because of that experience. I've had the Lord visit me 3 times in my life, the resurrected Christ, and each time he's manifested himself, it was never a tiptoe to the tulips for me. It was always, I wanted to hide under the carpet because, am I here to die? What are you going to do? What do you want from me? It was a powerful manifestation of Jesus. It was not this, we're pals and buddies kind of a thing. I did not see that. I saw him in his awesomeness. And when he looked through me, he knew everything about me. He knew every nook and cranny. And about a few moments after realizing this, realizing my own depravity, he spoke to me and he looked sternly into my eyes and he said, "Fear not, my son, for death will never hold you." This was unusual to me. And then instantly it was like a kind of a courage flooded through me. I wish I could tell you that I got very bold and preached a great sermon and got everybody saved. But I didn't. It was just courage to go through what was before me. And so these men strapped me down now. And this individual, by the way, before they strapped me down, they asked me one more time, "You can renounce him now." And I said, "No, he's the Lord of all." And I knew that he had saved me in the dream because of the prayer and the thing with that older man. But when I looked at him, I knew now, and I can tell you folks, I know for a certainty, he is the Lord of lords and the King of every king.